Somewhere in the Vatican archives, your confession is still on file. Not yours personally, but someone's ancestor. Someone who sat across a wooden table from a trained theologian in the 1300s and answered questions about what they believed, while a notary copied every word down in a careful hand. The Inquisition did not misplace paperwork. It did not lose track of cases. It followed up. So why did an institution built on the promise of divine mercy create the most organized, the most thorough, and the most softly spoken apparatus for human disappearance that the medieval world had ever seen? Toulouse, 1245. A wool merchant named Bernard sits on a wooden stool in a room that smells of tallow smoke and wet limestone, and he is trying very hard to remember exactly what his neighbor said about the bread at Mass. The friar across the desk is not shouting. He is not pacing. He is, in fact, being quite pleasant about the whole thing. He has offered Bernard water. He has asked after Bernard's family. He has smiled twice with what appears to be genuine warmth. And now he is asking, in a voice like a man requesting directions, whether Bernard could please repeat the precise words his neighbor used when describing the Eucharist. The words matter. The friar explains gently. The church wants to understand. The quill scratches across the parchment. That sound, dry and deliberate as a fingernail on stone, is the most dangerous thing in the room. This is where most people's mental image of the Inquisition breaks down entirely. The torture chambers, the bonfires, the hooded executioners, those things existed, but they were downstream of something far colder and far more modern. The Medieval Inquisition, formally organized under Pope Gregory IX in 1233, was not primarily a mob. It was a filing system. A network of trained Dominican and Franciscan friars who traveled circuit routes, opened offices, conducted interviews, and recorded everything in careful Latin on vellum that was then archived, cross-referenced, and retained for decades. If your name appeared in one document, it might surface in another investigation 30 years later in a town you had never visited, cited by a man you had never met. Imagine that. Not a sword. A spreadsheet. The genius of the system, if we can call something this sinister a genius, was courtesy. Inquisitors were instructed to be patient, methodical, and non-threatening in manner. The goal was not to terrify a confession out of someone in an afternoon. The goal was to build a record. To sit across from a frightened wool merchant and ask soft questions until the record contained enough detail to act on, or to file, or to share with a colleague 200 miles away who was interviewing someone else's neighbor. Bernard might leave that stone room unharmed. He might not hear anything for months. The waiting was, in many ways, the point. The room itself deserves a moment of attention. Stone walls that held the cold even in August. A single tallow candle throwing orange shadows that never quite reached the corners. The desk between the friar and the accused was not a barrier exactly. It was more of a frame, a suggestion that this was a conversation between two reasonable men, one of whom had the power to end the other's life. The accused had no lawyer, no right to face his accusers, no transcript of his own. The friar had all three, plus institutional memory stretching back a generation. Sound familiar? It should. We have rebuilt this architecture several times since, always with the same reassuring aesthetics. The politely worded email informing you that your account has been suspended pending review. The HR meeting in a neutral conference room with a box of tissues on the table. The algorithmic flag, invisible and patient, that attached itself to something you wrote 3 years ago and waited. We have never stopped building rooms where the most powerful thing present wears a friendly face and takes very careful notes. Which brings us to the question this story will keep asking, in different centuries and different languages, all the way through. How does an institution build a machine whose entire purpose is making people disappear? Not with violence as the first tool, but with compassion, paperwork, and a patience that could outlast any individual life. How do you construct a bureaucracy of erasure and convince everyone inside it that they are doing something kind? Bernard finishes his answer. The quill scratches. The friar nods. We should probably talk about how this office got started. By the year 1100, the Catholic Church owned approximately 1/3 of all land in Western Europe. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically, legally, taxably owned. Fields, forests, mills, rivers with fish in them. If you wanted to understand who ran medieval Europe, you did not look for a king first. You looked for the man in Rome. Think about what that actually meant. The church was the only institution operating at continental scale. It ran the hospitals. It ran the schools, all of them, because literacy was essentially a clerical monopoly. It ran the courts for enormous categories of law, marriage, inheritance, moral conduct, anything touching a soul, which conveniently was everything. It kept the calendar. It authenticated documents. When a king wanted his letters written, he hired a priest to write them, because who else could hold a pen? This was the world the Gregorian reforms had built. Pope Gregory VII, in the late 11th century, had spent his papacy hammering one idea into European governance. The church answers to God, not to kings. Bishops were not the king's men. The Pope was not a political ally to be managed. The church was a sovereign institution, and it intended to act like one. By 1100, it had largely won that argument. Don't worry. It gets more complicated. Here is the problem with winning everything. When your institution is also the mortar holding society together, any crack becomes structural. The feudal order was not just held together by swords and oaths. It was held together by shared cosmology. The serf worked because God had placed him in that station. The Lord ruled because God had ordained hierarchy. The king's crown was legitimate because the church said so, usually in writing, often at significant ceremony. Remove the shared belief, and you did not just have a theological disagreement. You had a peasant asking why exactly he owed his lord anything at all. Heresy, then, was not primarily an offense against heaven. It was an offense against the architecture of the living world. A man who questioned the Eucharist was also, whether he knew it or not, questioning the tax structure. The Cathar communities spreading through southern France in the 12th century were not simply preaching an alternative theology. They were building alternative social structures, alternative clergy, alternative ideas about matter and spirit that had no place for Rome or for the Lord's Rome validated. They were, from the church's perspective, less a flock of confused souls and more a competing operating system. And the church, as we established, did not like competition, which is precisely the moment when certain very organized men began asking what, exactly, should be done about it. Peter Waldo was a wealthy merchant in Lyon who, sometime around 1173, gave away everything he owned, not to a monastery, not to a bishop, to the poor directly on the street in person, and then walked away barefoot to preach the Gospels in the vernacular, which was already causing problems before he said a single theologically suspect word. The Waldensians who followed him were, by most observable measures, extremely good Christians. They memorized scripture. They fasted. They lived without property. They wandered from village to village preaching repentance, exactly as the apostles had done, exactly as the church theoretically admired. The uncomfortable detail was that they were doing it without Rome's permission, and in the 12th century, unauthorized holiness was its own kind of offense. Then there were the Cathars of Languedoc, who were theologically stranger and somehow even harder to argue with on moral grounds. Their theology was dualist. The material world was the creation of an evil force, and the soul's purpose was to escape it. Their spiritual elite, called the perfecti, lived accordingly. No meat, no sex, no property, no lying, reportedly, under any circumstances. They traveled in pairs, worked with their hands, and refused to swear oaths, which sounds minor until you remember that oaths were the legal glue of feudal society. The perfecti were, by all surviving accounts, serene, gentle, widely beloved. The ordinary believers around them, called credent, were not required to adopt this ascetic life themselves, but they protected the perfecti with genuine ferocity, not primarily because they could explain dualist cosmology at a dinner party, but because these wandering figures had sat with their sick relatives and refused to take money for it. Now consider the optics. A Cathar perfectus arrives in a village, thin, barefoot, calm, performing no miracles but charging no fees. A week later, the bishop arrives to explain why the perfectus is dangerous, fat with wine, mounted on a very good horse, accompanied by an entourage, with outstanding debts owed to him by half the village. The church noticed this was a presentation problem. Pope Innocent III, in the early 1300s, dispatched preaching missions into Languedoc specifically to out-argue and out-humble the heretics at their own game. The most famous effort came through a Spanish churchman named Diego of Osma, who suggested the legates try what the heretics were doing, walking on foot, carrying nothing, speaking plainly. The experiment was well-intentioned and largely ineffective. Wandering barefoot after a lifetime of institutional comfort is harder than it looks, and the locals had years of relationship with the perfecti that no preaching tour could undo in a fortnight. There were debates. Formal theological contests in town squares with agreed-upon rules and adjudicators. The church lost several of them, or at least failed to decisively win them, which in a live public forum amounts to the same thing. This is the moment when certain minds in Rome began to conclude that persuasion as a strategy had a ceiling, and that above that ceiling, sterner architecture might be required. On January 14, 1208, a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was riding home along the Rhône when someone put a lance through him. The assassination was almost certainly arranged by Raymond VI of Toulouse, a count with Cathar sympathizers in his court and a long, irritable history with Rome's representatives in the region. Whether Raymond personally ordered it or simply created the climate where it seemed like a reasonable idea is the kind of distinction that lawyers enjoy and popes do not. Pope Innocent III was not interested in nuance. He had spent years trying the patient approach, the preaching missions, the theological debates, the walking barefoot across Languedoc in imitation of apostolic poverty. The region had listened politely and remained largely unconvinced. Now, one of his men was dead in the mud beside a river, and patience, as a policy, had reached its natural conclusion. He called a crusade. Not against Muslims in the Holy Land this time. Against Christians in France. The army that assembled in the summer of 1209 was enormous, motivated partly by genuine religious fervor and partly by the standard crusade incentive package, which included the cancellation of debts and the opportunity to claim the lands of defeated heretics. Simon de Montfort, a minor French noble with a gift for sustained violence and absolute certainty about which side God was on, would eventually emerge as its driving force. Their first significant target was the city of Béziers in July of 1209. The city fell faster than anyone expected, breached almost by accident when overeager soldiers followed retreating defenders through the gates. What followed was a massacre of somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people, depending on who was writing the account and how much they wanted to impress or horrify their audience. The story attached to Béziers, possibly true and possibly not, is that a commander asked the papal legate Arnaud Amaury how to distinguish heretics from Catholics in the chaos. The reported reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether Arnaud actually said this, he never convincingly denied it, which tells you something about the atmosphere of the occasion. Don't worry, it gets worse. For the next 20 years, Simon de Montfort and his successors burned their way across Languedoc with considerable thoroughness. Towns fell. Castles fell. The aristocracy of the South, who had tolerated or protected the Cathars for generations, was systematically destroyed or dispossessed. And yet, you can burn a town. The smoke from Béziers was visible for miles, a thick gray column rising over what had been a prosperous cosmopolitan city. What you cannot do is burn an idea out of a population without first knowing which individuals in that population hold it. Soldiers are extraordinarily bad at this kind of precision work. A sword is not an interrogation tool. An army moving through a region leaves behind scorched earth, grievance, and the survivors of massacres, none of which are historically great for reducing ideological commitment. The crusade ended formally in 1229, with Catharism wounded but not dead, and the region traumatized into a sullen, smoldering submission. Rome had learned something expensive and important. If the goal was to find out exactly who believed what, and then deal with those specific people quietly and systematically, you needed a different kind of instrument entirely. Pope Gregory IX signed the papal bull Il Humani Generis on February 20th, 1231, and with that signature, Rome stopped improvising and started filing paperwork. This was, in its quiet way, a revolution. Not the kind with fire and armies. The church had already tried that, and you saw how it went. This was the other kind of revolution, the kind that happens in offices. Gregory created permanent, standing inquisitorial tribunals with defined jurisdiction, standardized procedure, and a direct line of authority running straight up to Rome. Not to the local bishop, not to the regional lord, to Rome. This detail is not administrative housekeeping. It is the entire point. Local bishops had been tasked with rooting out heresy for decades, and they had managed it with remarkable inconsistency. The reason was embarrassingly human. Bishops lived in their dioceses. They knew the families. They had dinner with the cousins of suspected heretics. They understood that accusing the merchant who funded the cathedral roof was a complicated social proposition. Community embeds you, and embeddedness makes you slow. Gregory did not need slow. Gregory needed people who would arrive in a town knowing nobody owing nothing to anyone below the level of God's own representative in Rome, and who would get to work. Enter the Dominicans. The order of preachers had been founded by Dominic de Guzman specifically to combat heresy through argument and preaching, which meant that every Dominican was, by training and vocation, a specialist in exactly the problem Gregory needed solved. They were theologians. They could debate. They had spent years learning the precise contours of heterodox belief, which is useful when your job is identifying it. They were also mendicants, meaning they owned nothing personally and depended on no local patron for their income or status. You cannot bribe a man with land he is not allowed to hold. You cannot threaten a man with social ruin in a community he has no stake in. The Dominicans were, from a bureaucratic design standpoint, almost frictionlessly incorruptible in exactly the right directions. They were also organized. This matters more than it sounds. An institution is only as durable as its procedures, and the Inquisition that Gregory assembled had procedures. Inquisitors followed standardized interrogation methods. They kept written records of testimony. There were rules about evidence and confession, about the use of torture, about appeals. Someone accused had the theoretical ability to challenge the process. The records could be reviewed. Decisions could be revisited. Pause on that for a moment. Jurisdiction. Written records. Standardized procedure. Appeals processes. Hierarchical accountability. If you assembled these features and removed the context of 13th century heresy law, a modern administrative theorist would recognize what you were looking at. Some historians have argued with reasonable seriousness that the Papal Inquisition was the first genuinely modern bureaucracy in the Western world, not in spite of its grim purpose, but precisely because the purpose required a machine that could operate consistently across time and geography without depending on the personality of any one operator. That is the cold elegance of it. The crusade had depended on Simon de Montfort's particular ferocity. When he died in 1218, struck by a stone from a catapult allegedly operated by women defending Toulouse, the campaign lost its momentum almost immediately. A bureaucracy does not die with its founder. A bureaucracy shows up on Monday morning regardless of who signed the original charter. The church had built something that could outlast any individual inquisitor, any pope, any local political arrangement. It had built a system. The Dominicans would arrive in a town with their written guidelines and their theological training, set up their tribunal, and begin the patient, methodical work of finding out exactly what people believed in the privacy of their own hearts. Whether that was terrifying or reassuring probably depended entirely on what you believed. What the machine looked like from the inside, how it actually ran its interviews and extracted its confessions and processed its cases, is where we turn next. Bernard Guy kept records. Meticulous, organized, cross-referenced records. Over nearly 17 years as inquisitor in Toulouse, he convicted over 600 people, and when he finally sat down to write up everything he had learned, the result was the Practica Inquisitionis, a comprehensive field manual for the business of saving souls against their will. Picture the document itself. Handwritten in careful Latin, organized into sections with specific chapters devoted to specific heresies. Cathars here. Waldensians there, pseudo-apostles, Jewish converts suspected of backsliding, sorcerers. Each category came with its own theological profile, its own diagnostic questions, its own particular vocabulary of evasion to watch for. It reads, in places, less like a theological treatise and more like a training packet for a customer service department where the product is eternal damnation. The sample interrogation scripts are where it gets genuinely impressive in the worst possible way. Guy anticipated that heretics, having been heretics for a while, had developed some facility with being questioned. A Cathar believer, for instance, knew to phrase things carefully. They might affirm that they believed everything a true Christian ought to believe, and mean something entirely different by the word Christian than the Inquisitor did. Guy's manual names this. It tells the Inquisitor what phrases to expect, what the phrases actually mean in heretical usage, and how to rephrase the question so the answer becomes harder to deflect. It is, in effect, a cheat sheet for catching people who had been practicing their answers. Then there was the Tempus Gratiae, the grace period. When inquisitors arrived in a new town, they would announce a window, usually 2 weeks, during which anyone who came forward voluntarily to confess received significantly lighter penance. This sounds almost merciful, and in a narrow technical sense it was. It was also extremely clever. Because once that window closed, the investigation began in earnest, and your neighbors had been sitting with 2 weeks of anxiety about who had already confessed, what they had said, and whether anyone's name had come up. Community trust, that warm and ambient thing, quietly curdled. The inquisitors had not even asked a question yet, and the social fabric was already loosening at the threads. This is the most chilling feature of the Practica as a document, its tone. Guy wrote with genuine care. He was thorough because thoroughness protected the innocent, he would have said, and he probably believed it. The manual cautions against excessive credulity, warns against accepting confessions too easily, instructs the inquisitor to be patient and methodical. Compassion and rigor appear throughout, not as ornament but as technique. The machinery of control wrapped in the language of pastoral concern. Imagine sitting across from someone who had read that manual. Someone patient, trained, unrushed, who had seen your particular variety of spiritual deviation before and had, somewhere in his bag, the exact questions designed for you specifically. The manual did not make the inquisitor cruel. It made him prepared, which was considerably more frightening. Guy's Practica was not the only handbook of its kind, merely one of the most complete. Others followed, each one refining the process a little further. Which raises the question of what happened when that process reached its conclusion and the paperwork moved from interrogation to sentencing. Jacques Fournier interrogated his first Montaillou villager in 1318, and he wrote everything down. Not summaries, not highlights, everything. The smell of a suspect's house mentioned offhandedly by a witness. The specific words spoken between neighbors on a cold morning 20 years before the interview. Who slept where, who argued with whom, who said something strange at a funeral. Fournier, who would later become Pope Benedict XII, was building a heresy case against a small village in the Pyrenees. What he actually built, without meaning to, was the most intimate portrait of medieval peasant life that has ever survived. This is where the Inquisition's paperwork fetish becomes genuinely strange. The register system worked like this. Every testimony was recorded, copied, and preserved. Every name a witness mentioned, even in passing, entered the archive. If you named your neighbor in 1247, that name sat in a file patient as a stone until 1262, when a new investigation might pull the register open and find it waiting there. Decades could pass. The file did not mind. The file had nowhere to be. Cross-referencing turned individual confessions into something more like a net. Each interrogation was not just evidence about one person. It was a thread that connected backward and forward to other names, other testimonies, other files. The inquisitors were building, incrementally, a map of social relationships. Who trusted whom? Who influenced whom? Who had been in the same room during a suspicious conversation in the summer of 1231? It is, if you remove the theological stakes entirely, a remarkably modern data architecture. The Inquisition invented something very close to the social graph, and they did it with ink and sheepskin. Fournier's register from Montejo is the jewel of this archive. In the 1970s, historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie used it as the primary source for his landmark book, simply titled Montejo. He found, buried inside the interrogation records, an entire world. Peasants described their daily routines, their sleeping arrangements, their opinions about death and God and marriage, and whether the soul survived the body. They talked about their childhoods, their grudges, their desires. They talked because Fournier asked, and because the alternative to talking was worse, and because people, it turns out, will eventually tell a patient listener almost anything. The irony is almost too tidy to be real. The most detailed record of medieval common life, the one that lets historians actually hear peasant voices rather than inferring them from aristocratic accounts, exists because someone was building a criminal case. The warmth and texture of those vanished lives survived precisely because the Inquisition needed evidence. Every intimate detail Fournier recorded was gathered for prosecution. History preserved it for entirely different reasons. Imagine being the subject of that file. Your name, your words, your neighbor's account of something you said beside a fire 15 years ago, all of it organized, cross-referenced, waiting. Not forgotten. Never forgotten. The register did not need to threaten anyone. Its existence was the threat. And the records did not stop at confession. Once the interrogation closed, the machinery moved to its next phase, which required an entirely different kind of document. The inquisitor arrived in town on a Sunday, which was deliberate. The timing meant the largest possible audience was already assembled, dressed, and vaguely obligated to pay attention. He would preach a sermon, and in that sermon, he would extend what the church called the period of grace, typically between 15 and 30 days, during which anyone with heretical associations could come forward voluntarily and be treated with relative leniency. The word leniency is doing considerable work in that sentence. The grace period was, structurally, a trap dressed as a mercy. Come forward and confess, and your penalty might be reduced. But to confess credibly, you had to name others. And naming others opened new investigations, which generated new sermons, which produced new grace periods, which required new confessions. The machine fed itself. The inquisitor could sit in one town for months simply by letting the denunciations accumulate. Don't worry. It gets worse. If you did not come forward voluntarily and were later accused anyway, your refusal to self-report during the grace period counted against you. The period of mercy was also a period of evidence collection about who had chosen not to participate in mercy. It is the kind of administrative elegance that should make you deeply uncomfortable. The interrogation itself was private and recorded by notaries, word by word, session by session. Questions were asked in one sitting and repeated weeks later, sometimes months later with slightly different phrasing. The interval was intentional. Memory is inconsistent, and inconsistency, in an inquisitorial court, looked like lying, and lying about heresy was itself evidence of heresy. You can feel the architecture closing around you from every direction. Defendants technically had access to legal counsel. The catch, and there was absolutely a catch, was that a defense lawyer who argued too strenuously risked being investigated himself for obstructing the faith. The result was a legal representation system that functioned primarily as a formality, like decorative columns on a building that hold up nothing. The spectrum of penalties ran from pilgrimages and public penance, which were humiliating but survivable, through the wearing of yellow crosses sewn onto clothing, which marked a person for their entire community every single day, through confiscation of property, which devastated families for generations, and finally into imprisonment, which in the 13th and 14th centuries meant conditions that make the phrase imprisonment feel inadequate. And then there was the highest penalty, which the Church, with remarkable composure, insisted was not its penalty at all. The condemned were relaxed to the secular arm, meaning handed to civil authorities. The Church included a formal plea for mercy in the paperwork. Everyone present understood this plea to mean the opposite of what it said. The civil authorities understood it. The condemned understood it. The chroniclers who recorded these events understood it. The Church maintained the fiction in careful Latin, and the fires were lit, and the Church had technically never killed anyone. The paperwork said so. It was, by any honest accounting, an institution that had industrialized the production of procedural innocence. Every step designed to look fair. Every exit blocked before you reached it. How the records of all this were organized and preserved, and what happened to them across the centuries, is its own strange story. Pope Innocent IV signed Ad Extirpanda in 1252, and with that signature, the careful fiction of purely spiritual persuasion became somewhat harder to maintain. The bull authorized inquisitors to use torture. It did this characteristically with conditions. Torture could be applied only once per charge. It could not draw blood. It could not endanger life or cause permanent injury. A physician was required to be present. These were the rules, written down, official, designed to demonstrate that the Church was not being barbaric but precise. Here is where the bureaucratic mind truly earns your admiration, or something like it. The rule said torture could be applied once. What the rule did not fully close off was the question of what constituted once. Inquisitors developed the concept of continuation. A session could be interrupted and resumed the next day or the day after, and still technically counted as one session, the same single permitted instance. The physician certified that the subject was well enough to continue, and the questioning continued, and it was all still, on paper, one event. Legally tidy. Practically inexhaustible. The smell in those rooms would have been close and particular. Stone walls, tallow candles, the kind of cold that settles into joints. The physician's presence meant to signal restraint. Also meant that the process could be extended right up to the edge of what a body could bear and no further. Regulated right to the threshold and held there. This is the detail that should unsettle you most. Random brutality can be opposed. It has no logic to argue back against. But a system with rules, oversight, documentation, and a certified medical professional on the premises is a system that presents itself as reasonable. It invites you to engage with its procedures rather than reject its premises. You find yourself debating the definition of once rather than asking why any of this exists. The regulations made the torture more defensible, which made the institution more durable, which meant more people encountered it across more decades than they would have if the whole thing had simply been openly savage. The paperwork, as always, was doing considerable work. Confession extracted under these conditions was then added to the careful notarial records, signed or marked by the accused, and filed. The file grew. The file was, in a sense, the whole point. What happened to a person once the confession was complete, and what the penalties that followed actually looked like in practice, is where the machinery showed its full range. In the village of Montaillou, in the French Pyrenees, Inquisitor Jacques Fournier interviewed roughly 500 people between 1318 and 1325. He did not need soldiers for most of it. He had neighbors. The Inquisition's most efficient tool was never the strappado or the carefully regulated session in the stone-walled room. It was the person who lived next door. The system had, quite early on, recognized something that any experienced manager of large organizations understands. The most scalable solution is to outsource the labor. Here is how the outsourcing worked. Every Christian had a formal obligation to denounce suspected heresy, not a moral suggestion, an obligation. Failure to report what you had seen or heard was itself an offense, punishable by the same institution you had failed to assist. So when your neighbor said something unusual about the soul, or skipped a feast day, or seemed to receive certain visitors after dark, you had a choice. You could say nothing and become, in the eyes of the tribunal, complicit. Or you could walk to the inquisitor's office and speak. Most people, eventually, walked. What made this especially elegant from an administrative standpoint was the anonymity. The accused almost never learned who had denounced them. The names of informants were withheld from the record given to the defense. You might spend months inside a proceeding trying to reconstruct which conversation, which meal, which offhand remark had brought the summons to your door, and you would never know. Trust under those conditions doesn't erode gradually. It collapses in a single afternoon. Communities under this pressure developed a particular atmosphere. Imagine sitting down to a shared meal and weighing every word before it left your mouth. Imagine the specific texture of a conversation where both people are performing normalcy for an audience that may or may not exist. In Montaillou and places like it, the documentary record shows families denouncing in-laws, laborers reporting employers, old grievances finding new paperwork. The Inquisition did not create human pettiness. It simply gave pettiness institutional form and a receptive filing system. For those found guilty of lighter offenses, the penalties included the wearing of yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing. 2 of them, front and back, wide enough to be visible at a distance. The penitent moved through the market, the church, the fields marked. Conversations stopped. Space cleared. The yellow cross was not primarily a punishment for the individual. It was a communication to everyone else about what cooperation with heresy looked like, made flesh and made to walk around in public doing errands. The inquisitor sitting at his desk processing the incoming reports was by this point functioning less like an investigator and more like a receiving clerk. The community had done the surveillance. The community had done the initial assessment. The community had, in many cases, already reached its own verdict. He was there to make it official, to apply the procedural weight of the institution, to sign the document that the neighbors had, in effect, already drafted. What the condemned wore, what they confessed, and what the church ultimately did with the most serious cases is where this system reveals its final, most public face. By the early 1400s, the Cathars were essentially gone. Not converted, not persuaded. Gone. The Inquisition had done its job with the kind of thoroughness that should, in any sensible organization, trigger a memo about winding down operations. No such memo arrived. Instead, the machinery looked around, found the world still full of people, and got back to work. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, represents the institutional pivot in its most confident form. Its original target was the converso population, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, sometimes voluntarily, often under considerable pressure, and who were now suspected of practicing their old faiths in private. The question of whether someone's conversion was sincere is, when you think about it, exactly the kind of question that requires an enormous bureaucratic apparatus to investigate and can never be fully resolved. Which made it perfect. What made Spain distinct was the relationship between the church and the crown. The Spanish Inquisition reported to the monarchy as much as to Rome. It was a tool of state, of religious purity, and of social control all at once, which meant it had 3 different sets of patrons with 3 different lists of problems to solve. The conversos were followed by the Moriscos, then Protestants, then anyone whose beliefs, behaviors, or enemies made them a suitable candidate for the procedure. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, was the Counter-Reformation's answer to Martin Luther. Protestantism had arrived. Printing presses were spreading ideas at a speed that genuinely alarmed Rome, and the church needed a centralized response. The new tribunal was sharper, more systematic, and operated across the Italian peninsula with the focused energy of an institution that had spent 3 centuries refining its methods. This is the part historians sometimes call the logic of self-perpetuation. A department built to solve a specific problem does not, as a rule, solve the problem and dissolve itself. It solves the problem and looks for the next one. It has staff, procedures, buildings, and accumulated expertise. It has people whose entire professional identity is the work. Declaring victory and closing is almost never what institutions do. The Inquisition ran, in various national forms, into the 19th century. The Spanish version was not formally abolished until 1834. By then, it had outlived Catharism by roughly 400 years, which tells you something useful about the relationship between problems and the offices created to address them. What happened inside those offices to the people who passed through them is a question the records answer in considerable and uncomfortable detail. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has offices in Vatican City, employs a small army of theologians, and has a website. It is, in the most procedural sense, the Inquisition. Same office, different letterhead. Pope Paul VI renamed it in 1965, which is the institutional equivalent of a company rebranding after a public relations incident and hoping no one checks the founding documents. The rename was not cynical, exactly. It was structural. The spectacle had become the problem. The bonfire, the public confession, the theater of coerced repentance had always been the part that attracted crowds, critics, and eventually historians with strong opinions. Remove the spectacle, the logic goes, and what remains is simply process. Administration. A quiet conversation, a formal letter, a finding. The disappearance without the drama of disappearing. This is the design pattern that survived. Consider what algorithmic content moderation actually is. A system that receives reports from other users, evaluates speech against a defined standard of acceptable belief, and removes content that fails the test. The reports come in. The file is opened. The finding is made. The account goes silent. No one is burned. The whole thing happens in a data center somewhere, processed by a system that has never heard of Bernard Guy and would not find the comparison flattering, but would struggle to identify the structural difference. Human resources departments perform something similar with remarkable consistency. A complaint is received. An investigation is opened, confidentially, which means the subject learns they are under review without learning quite what they are accused of or who did the accusing. A finding is produced. The outcome is communicated in a meeting with a neutral voice and a prepared document. The language is careful, procedural, and carries the implicit message that this is not personal. This is simply how things are done. The Spanish Inquisition could not have said it better, and in fact did say something quite similar in slightly more ecclesiastical Latin. The filing cabinet endures most of all. The inquisitorial register, that meticulous record of names and beliefs and associations and findings, was the genuine innovation, not the rack. The rack was ancient. The index was new. Today, the descendants of those registers are larger than anything Bernard Guy could have imagined, and they are held not by the church, but by every platform, employer, and institution that has discovered the same quiet truth. Knowing what people think and having that knowledge organized and retrievable is the more durable form of power. The bonfire was always theater. Loud, obvious, and ultimately counterproductive, since martyrs have a way of becoming arguments. The form is different. The form is quiet. The form arrives as a suspension notice, a performance improvement plan, a finding of non-compliance. It does not create martyrs. It creates former employees, deplatformed accounts, and people who find it genuinely difficult to explain to others what happened to them. Because what happened to them was a process, and processes are hard to argue with. The most efficient way to make people disappear has never been violence. It has been paperwork, delivered by someone who sounds very sorry about the whole thing.